The Substance, a Movie Retold, by David Eden. Chapter 1, The Star Dims. The needle slipped into the yolk like a silver tongue tasting something forbidden. Elisabeth Sparkle watched from her hospital bed as the memory played behind her closed eyelids. That first injection all those months ago, the fluorescent yellow serum that had promised everything and delivered exactly what it said it would. The problem was, she'd never read the fine print written in her own blood. But that was getting ahead of herself. The story really began with the star. Her star, to be precise. The one embedded in the Hollywood Walk of Fame that bore her name in brass letters that had once gleamed like hope itself. Elisabeth had been there the day they'd installed it, 23 years old, and believing the world was a stage built just for her performance. The photographer's flashes had popped like tiny supernovas, and she'd knelt beside that pink marble slab, feeling like she was touching the face of God. Now, as she lay in the sterile embrace of the hospital bed, she thought about how quickly stars cooled once they stopped burning. The morning had started like any other, with lies told to a camera and sweat disguised as vitality. Sparkle Your Life with Elisabeth filmed at 6 a.m. sharp, when the California sun slid through the studio windows like divine approval. She'd been teaching the same damn aerobics routine for 15 years, her body moving through the familiar choreography while her mind wandered to darker territories. "I know it's hard," she'd chirped to the cameras, her smile so wide it felt like her face might crack. "Think about your bikini this summer. You don't want to look like a giant jellyfish on the beach, do you?" The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, 50 years old, and still promising other women they could achieve the impossible: eternal youth, perfect bodies, happiness measured in inches lost and calories burned. The cruel joke was that she'd started believing her own marketing. Walking down the backstage corridor afterward, Elisabeth had passed the gallery of her former selves, framed posters from every season of the show, her face growing progressively more photoshopped with each passing year. The progression told a story she didn't want to read, a slow fade from authentic beauty to desperate simulation. The bathroom encounter had been the first crack in her carefully constructed reality. She'd hidden in the men's room like a criminal, splashing cold water on her face and trying to wash away the exhaustion that had seeped into her bones. That's when Harvey's voice had cut through the silence like a rusty blade. "How the old bitch has managed to stay this long in the first place is a fucking mystery." The words had hit her with the force of physical blows. Each syllable was a small death, a reminder that in Hollywood, a woman's expiration date was printed in invisible ink that only showed up under the harsh light of a younger girl's ambition. The lunch that followed was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. Harvey had delivered the news between mouthfuls of shrimp, his thick fingers peeling away shells with the same casual indifference he showed while dismantling her career. "At 50, it stops," he'd said, and she'd known exactly what he meant. Not just her show, everything. Relevance, desire, the basic human courtesy of being seen as something other than a cautionary tale. The car accident that came after felt almost inevitable, like the universe's way of putting an exclamation point on her professional obituary. One moment she was speeding down Sunset Boulevard, her eyes burning with unshed tears, and the next she was spinning through space and time, glass exploding around her like falling stars. But it was in the hospital that the real story began. The young nurse with the piercing blue eyes had seemed like an angel at first, beautiful in that effortless way that reminded Elisabeth of her own lost youth. His hands had been steady as he examined her, pressing along her spine with clinical precision. "You're a good candidate," he'd whispered, and something in his voice had made her skin crawl. Later, she'd found the USB stick in her coat pocket like a message from another world. 3 simple words scrawled on crumpled paper. "It changed my life." Now, lying in the hospital bed with Harvey's cruel laughter still echoing in her ears, Elisabeth rolled the small device between her fingers. The plastic was warm to the touch, as if it contained something alive. She didn't know it yet, but she was holding the key to her own destruction, or transformation. In the end, those might be the same thing. Outside her window, Los Angeles sprawled beneath a sky the color of old bruises, and somewhere in the distance a star was being born, while another prepared to die. The choice was hers to make. The needle was waiting. Chapter 2: The Devil's Bargain. The apartment felt like a mausoleum when Elisabeth returned home. Every surface seemed to mock her with memories of a life that was rapidly becoming past tense. The framed poster of herself dominated the living room wall, a grinning monument to everything she was losing. In the photograph, her smile was nuclear bright, her body carved from marble and dreams. The woman who stared back from that image might as well have been a stranger. The bouquet on the coffee table had already begun to wilt, its edges browning like autumn leaves. The card attached made her stomach turn. "Thank you for all these years with us. You were amazing." That past tense hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent 30 years building a career, and they'd demolished it with a single word. Elisabeth poured herself 3 fingers of bourbon and settled into her leather chair, the USB stick warm in her palm. Outside, the city glittered with 10 million dreams, most of them destined to die in obscurity. She'd almost joined their ranks today. The black screen held her reflection for a moment, a ghost woman in a ghost apartment, haunted by everything she used to be. Then the video began. The voice that emerged from her speakers was honey poured over broken glass, seductive and dangerous in equal measure. It spoke of genetic codes frozen in time, of DNA hiding billions of possibilities like buried treasure. Elisabeth found herself leaning forward, mesmerized despite herself. "Inside of you, there is another you," the voice promised. "Younger, more beautiful, more perfect." The demonstration that followed was elegant in its simplicity. 2 balls of clay, one perfectly smooth, the other imperfect and dented. The hands in the video shaped them with surgical precision, showing how one could become 2, how perfection could be extracted from flawed material. "You just have to share," the voice concluded. 1 week for one, and 1 week for the other. When the video ended, Elisabeth sat in the darkness for a long time. The words echoed in her mind like a mantra, like a prayer to a god she wasn't sure she believed in. She thought about Harvey's cruel laughter, about the empty hallway where her photographs used to hang, about the slow fade from relevance to obsolescence. She threw the USB stick in the garbage and went to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her reflection in Harvey's office window, a middle-aged woman watching her world crumble in real time. She thought about Fred from high school, bald and pathetic, telling her she was still the most beautiful girl in the world while clearly not believing it himself. She thought about the roles she'd never get, the chances that had already passed her by, the calendar pages turning like a countdown to irrelevance. At 3 in the morning, she found herself standing over the garbage can, fishing the USB stick from the coffee grounds and wilted flowers. The phone number led her to a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. No pleasantries, no explanations, just an address and a click. By the time dawn painted the sky pink, Elisabeth was standing in front of a rusted metal door in a neighborhood that tourist maps pretended didn't exist. The facility was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow worse. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects, casting everything in the sickly pallor of an emergency room. The package waited in a box marked 503, and Elisabeth signed for it with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. Back home, she spread the contents across her coffee table like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Vials filled with golden liquid, syringes that gleamed like promises, plastic tubes marked with cryptic instructions. The activator looked innocent enough, a small yellow bottle that could have contained vitamins or children's medicine. The bathroom mirror showed her every flaw in merciless detail. The lines around her eyes had deepened since morning, or maybe she was just seeing them clearly for the first time. Her breast sagged with the inexorable pull of gravity, and her stomach bore the soft evidence of 50 years of living. She thought about Sue, the young dancer who'd taken her place, all curves and confidence and casual cruelty. Sue's face had been porcelain perfect, unmarked by time or disappointment. Elisabeth wondered what it would feel like to inhabit skin like that again, to move through the world as something beautiful rather than something pitied. The needle slid into her vein like a silver fish swimming upstream. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The pain was beyond description. every cell in her body screaming as it divided and multiplied and transformed. Elisabeth felt herself splitting like a seed pod, her consciousness fracturing as something new forced its way out of her flesh. Her back tore open with a wet, organic sound, and through the agony, she caught a glimpse of something impossible. Another spine, another body, another her. The darkness that followed was absolute, a void so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, the taste of copper, the smell of blood, the feeling of lying on cold tiles in a puddle of her own transformation. But it wasn't her lying there anymore. Not entirely. The woman who stood before the bathroom mirror was everything Elisabeth had lost and more. 20-something skin stretched over muscle and bone like silk over steel. Hair that caught light like spun gold, eyes that sparkled with possibility rather than resignation. She was perfect. She was beautiful. She was new. And lying on the floor behind her, connected by plastic tubing like an umbilical cord, was the price she'd paid. Elisabeth, the real Elisabeth, lay motionless, her back sutured shut, her breathing shallow but steady. The Matrix, the voice had called her, the source from which all beauty flowed. The new woman touched her face, marveling at the smoothness of her skin. She had Elisabeth's memories but not her scars, her knowledge but not her damage. She was a rough draft made perfect, a song played in a higher key. She decided to call herself Sue. Outside, Los Angeles glittered with the same 10 million dreams, but now one of them belonged to her. The city had no idea what it was about to unleash upon itself, this perfect predator in a world that worshipped perfection above all else. Sue smiled at her reflection, and her teeth were white as fresh snow. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 3: New Flesh. Sue's first breath in her new body tasted like electricity and possibility. The air itself seemed different, richer, more alive, charged with potential that made her fingertips tingle. She stood before the bathroom mirror for what felt like hours, cataloging every perfect detail of her transformation. This wasn't just youth restored, this was youth perfected, as if someone had taken Elisabeth's best features and refined them through some divine algorithm. Her reflection showed a stranger wearing her memories. The birthmark that had decorated Elisabeth's torso had migrated, now resting like a beauty mark on her breast. Her waist carved inward with mathematical precision, and when she moved, her body responded with liquid grace that made her previous self seem arthritic by comparison. Behind her, Elisabeth lay motionless on the bathroom tiles, connected to an IV drip that fed her nutrients, while Sue inhabited their shared consciousness. The sight should have disturbed her, this corpse-like version of herself breathing through mechanical assistance, but instead, Sue felt only mild distaste. It was like looking at a snake's shed skin, necessary for what came before, but ultimately just discarded matter. The voice she discovered in her throat was honey over velvet, each word shaped by lips that had never known the burden of disappointment. When she spoke her new name aloud, Sue, it felt like christening a ship before its maiden voyage. The outside world beckoned with promises that had been closed to Elisabeth for years. Sue dressed carefully, choosing clothes that showed off her new body without being obvious about it. The simple act of walking down the street became a masterclass in power dynamics. Men stumbled over their own feet to get a better look. Women's eyes tracked her with mixtures of envy and admiration. Children stared with the frank appreciation of those too young to hide their thoughts. The casting call was almost too easy. She'd walked into that sterile audition room expecting the usual cattle call humiliation, but instead found herself the center of a gravitational pull she'd forgotten existed. The casting director's eyes went wide when she entered, and she could practically hear his breath catch. "Looks like everything sure is in the right place this time," he'd muttered, and Sue had smiled with teeth that could have lit up Times Square. Harvey's reaction was even better. The fat man practically salivated when she walked into his office, his small eyes lighting up like a child's on Christmas morning. He circled her like a predator who'd found something even more dangerous than himself, and Sue let him, knowing exactly what kind of power she wielded. "What a gorgeous little angel," he'd breathed, and Sue had almost laughed. If only he knew what kind of angel he was dealing with, the fallen kind, the ones who remembered heaven but chose hell because it was more interesting. The morning show materialized around her like a fever dream of success. Pump It Up with Sue had a ring to it that Sparkle Your Life never quite achieved. Where Elisabeth's show had been about self-improvement, Sue's was about transformation, the kind that reached deeper than exercise routines and inspirational mantras. She moved through the routines with predatory grace, her body a weapon disguised as entertainment. The camera loved her with an intensity that was almost physical, and she could feel viewers falling under her spell through the electronic ether. This wasn't just aerobics, it was a form of hypnosis, with Sue as both the hypnotist and the suggestion planted in 10 million minds. The ratings confirmed what she already knew. She was a star in the old Hollywood sense, the kind that burned bright enough to blind everyone around them. The network executives circled her like moths drawn to flame, each one convinced they could harness her light for their own purposes. But Sue had learned from Elisabeth's mistakes. She wouldn't be controlled or diminished or pushed aside when something newer came along. She was the newer thing, the evolution that made everything else obsolete. The secret room she constructed between the bathroom and bedroom closet was born from practical necessity. Elisabeth needed somewhere to rest during Sue's weeks, and Sue needed somewhere to store the evidence of what she'd become. The hidden chamber felt like a cocoon in reverse, not a place of transformation, but a repository for what had been discarded. As Sue dragged Elisabeth's inert form into the darkness, she felt a twinge of something that might have been guilt. But it passed quickly, replaced by the more familiar sensation of ambition. Elisabeth had had her time in the sun. Now it was Sue's turn to burn bright, and she intended to make the most of every moment. The billboard that appeared outside her window felt like a coronation. 50 feet of Sue's perfect face smiled down at the city, promising things that ordinary people could only dream of achieving. She stood at the window each morning, coffee in hand, admiring her electronic twin. Sometimes, late at night when the city quieted to a whisper, Sue could hear Elisabeth breathing in the secret room. The sound was barely audible through the walls, but it reminded her of the price that had been paid for her perfection. She tried not to think about it too much. After all, every angel needed a foundation to stand on, even if that foundation was made of discarded flesh and abandoned dreams. The balance was perfect. The voice on the phone had promised. 7 days for one, 7 days for the other. But as Sue grew stronger and more beautiful with each passing day, she began to wonder if balance was really what she wanted. Some hungers, once awakened, could never be satisfied, and Sue was very, very hungry. Chapter 4. The Price of Perfection. The finger arrived first, like a telegram from hell delivered to Elisabeth's own hand. She woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, the familiar ache of transition settling into her bones like an old friend. The switch back from Sue always felt like dying in reverse, consciousness trickling back into a body that felt increasingly foreign to her. But this time, something was different. This time, something was wrong. The index finger on her right hand had transformed overnight into something from a medical textbook's chapter on geriatric pathology. The skin was parchment thin and mottled with age spots, the knuckles swollen with arthritis that made even the smallest movement a symphony of pain. Yellow nail, thick as horn, crowned the digit like a tainted jewel. Elisabeth stared at the aberration with the detached fascination of someone discovering a malignant tumor. This wasn't the natural aging process accelerated. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to violations of the cosmic order she'd entered into with the substance. The empty vial on the bathroom floor told the story she didn't want to read. Sue had taken extra time, stolen hours from Elisabeth's already diminished allotment. The arithmetic of existence had been thrown off balance, and Elisabeth's body was paying the price in installments of decay. The phone call to the substance's mysterious providers brought no comfort, only the clinical detachment of a customer service representative from the depths of hell. The voice on the other end was limestone and graveyard dirt, explaining the rules she'd broken with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "What has been used on one side is lost on the other side," the voice intoned. "There is no going back." Elisabeth's protest died in her throat. She knew, with the certainty that comes from looking directly into the abyss, that this was only the beginning. Sue was a cancer in their shared existence, growing stronger while Elisabeth withered away one stolen hour at a time. The Fred incident crystallized her desperation into something sharp and cutting. She'd called him in a moment of weakness, her deformed finger dialing the crumpled number like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The plan had been simple: dinner, conversation, the basic human connection that might remind her why she'd chosen to remain alive in the first place. But standing in her bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of attempted beauty, Elisabeth saw herself through imaginary eyes. The evening dress that had once flattered now seemed to mock the body it covered. Her makeup felt like a mask painted by a blind artist, each layer of foundation and rouge an attempt to resurrect something that was already dead. The bathroom mirror became her confessional, reflecting truths she didn't want to acknowledge. She applied makeup with increasingly desperate strokes, each layer trying to hide the damage that Sue's selfishness had wrought. But the finger remained, accusatory and horrible, a tumor of time that no amount of concealer could disguise. The date never happened. Elisabeth sat in her apartment as the hours ticked by, paralyzed by the knowledge that she was no longer fit for human consumption. Fred would be waiting at Luigi's, checking his watch and wondering where she'd gone. Eventually, he'd order alone, maybe tell himself a story about how famous people were unreliable. The truth, that she'd become something too damaged for public display, would remain her secret burden. The television became her companion instead, its blue glow painting the walls of her apartment in shades of electronic loneliness. She watched Sue's show with the fascination of a car accident victim studying footage of her own destruction. There was Sue, perfect and radiant, leading a group of equally perfect dancers through routines that made Elisabeth's old show look positively geriatric. "In the meantime," Sue said, blowing a kiss to the camera, "take care of yourself." The irony was razor sharp. Sue was taking care of herself by consuming Elisabeth piece by piece, hour by stolen hour. The cooking began as therapy and evolved into obsession. Harvey's Gift, a cookbook of French cuisine, became Elisabeth's Bible during the long days when Sue commandeered their shared body. She worked her way through recipes with methodical precision, as if the act of creation could somehow balance out the destruction happening at the cellular level. Aubrac aligot bubbled on the stove like molten gold. Blood sausage sizzled in pans with sounds that reminded her, uncomfortably, of organic processes better left unexamined. She stuffed turkey after turkey, her arthritic hands working the cold flesh with the dedication of a penitent seeking absolution through repetition. But even cooking couldn't fill the hours or quiet the growing horror of her situation. Each time she switched back from Sue, more damage was evident. A leg withered with varicose veins that looked like roadmaps to nowhere. Patches of skin that had aged decades in days. A spine that curved like a question mark punctuated by pain. The secret room that Sue had constructed became Elisabeth's tomb. Hidden between walls like a Victorian scandal, the space reeked of neglect and casual cruelty. Sue dragged her there each switch like she was disposing of garbage, showing less care than someone might give to an old coat destined for donation. The man in the diner, the one with the familiar birthmark and knowing eyes, had been a messenger from a future Elisabeth didn't want to contemplate. His card marked with 207 told her she wasn't alone in her suffering, that somewhere in the city, another matrix was being consumed by their own perfected parasite. "It gets harder each time to remember that you still deserve to exist," he'd warned, and Elisabeth felt those words settling into her bones like calcium deposits. The violence of it hit her all at once during one particularly brutal switch. She'd found herself waking up in the secret room with Sue's memories of a night out, fragments of laughter and sex and casual betrayal that felt like shards of glass embedded in her consciousness. Sue had taken extra hours again, not many, just enough to tip the scales further toward Elisabeth's destruction. This time, the punishment manifested as a withered breast, saggy and deflated like a punctured balloon. Elisabeth stared at the asymmetry in the bathroom mirror, her good breast mocking its deteriorated twin. The image was so grotesque, so fundamentally wrong, that she found herself laughing until the laughter became sobs. Sue was killing her by degrees, and Elisabeth was letting it happen. The realization came with the force of religious revelation. She had to fight back. Not with words or pleading or appeals to their shared humanity, but with action. Sue understood only power, only the currency of beauty and time. Elisabeth looked at her reflection, half ruined, half whole, a living monument to the price of perfection, and began to plan. The war for their shared soul was about to begin. Chapter 5: War of Selves. The New Year's Eve show was supposed to be Sue's coronation. Instead, it became the night everything fell apart. Elisabeth had watched the preparations from her tomb-like secret room with the patience of a spider waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Through the thin walls, she could hear Sue's excitement. Phone calls about costume fittings, meetings with network executives, the breathless anticipation of someone about to claim their rightful throne. 50 million viewers would be watching. 50 million witnesses to Sue's moment of triumph. But Elisabeth had other plans. The termination kit arrived in a box that might have contained chocolates or jewelry, its contents wrapped in the same white packaging as the original substance. One vial of black liquid, thick as oil and just as poisonous. One syringe designed for cardiac injection. One simple instruction: inject directly into the heart to end the experience permanently. Elisabeth held the vial up to the pale light filtering through the secret room's air vent. The liquid inside moved like liquid night, consuming light rather than reflecting it. This was death in a bottle, the final solution to a problem that had grown beyond her ability to control. Sue's theft had accelerated beyond mere hours. Entire days vanished into the hungry maw of her selfishness, leaving Elisabeth to wake in increasingly decrepit states. Her body now resembled something dug up from a Victorian cemetery, skin like tissue paper, bones visible through translucent flesh, joints swollen with arthritis that made every movement a negotiation with pain. The night of the show, Sue's panic was palpable through the walls. Elisabeth could hear her pacing, muttering to herself, the confident predator reduced to a neurotic mess by the demands of her own perfection. The stabilizer fluid, the spinal tap juice that kept Sue's borrowed body functioning, had run dry. Sue's theft had finally caught up with her. Elisabeth smiled in the darkness. Sometimes the best revenge was simply watching someone destroy themselves. The phone call that followed was music to Elisabeth's withered ears. Sue, begging the voice on the other end for a solution, for more time, for anything that would let her keep her stolen paradise. The answer was simple and absolute: switch back to Elisabeth, let the fluid regenerate, or face the consequences. But Sue's vanity wouldn't allow it. Not tonight, not with 50 million people waiting to worship at the altar of her perfection. Elisabeth felt Sue's desperation like a physical thing, seeping through the walls and settling into her bones. This was how prey felt when the hunter realized they'd walked into a trap. This was what happened when the parasite finally understood that it was killing its host. The forced switch came in the small hours of the morning, Sue's body finally giving out under the strain of its own impossible beauty. Elisabeth felt consciousness slam back into her ruined form with the force of a sledgehammer blow. Pain radiated from every nerve ending, and when she tried to speak, her voice emerged as a death rattle. But she was awake, she was aware, and for the first time in months, she was in control. Sue's boyfriend, some leather-clad pretty boy who looked like he'd stepped out of a motorcycle magazine, hammered on the bathroom door with increasing desperation. Elisabeth listened to his confusion with the same detached amusement she might feel watching ants scramble when their hill was kicked. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice like gravel in a blender. "Get the fuck out of here!" The boy fled, and Elisabeth was alone with her reflection. The thing that stared back from the bathroom mirror was barely human, a walking corpse animated by spite and the last dregs of determination. Her spine curved like a question mark, her skin mottled with liver spots and premature decay. She looked like something that belonged in a medical textbook's chapter on accelerated aging. Perfect. The termination syringe felt heavy in her arthritic hands as she stood over Sue's unconscious form. One injection, straight to the heart, and it would all be over. No more theft, no more decay, no more watching herself be consumed piece by her own creation. The needle slid into Sue's chest with surprising ease, and Elizabeth felt a moment of pure satisfaction as she began to depress the plunger. The black liquid flowed into Sue's heart like liquid vengeance, and for a moment, Elizabeth thought she'd won. But then she saw the card beside the roses. "They're going to love you," and something in her chest cracked like an egg. This was her chance, her moment. The New Year's Eve show that would put her back on top, make her relevant again, remind the world that Elizabeth Sparkle still had something to offer. All she had to do was let Sue die and step back into the spotlight herself. Except she couldn't. Not like this. Not in a body that looked like it had been excavated from a plague pit. The CPR she performed was desperate and clumsy, her withered hands pushing against Sue's chest with what little strength remained in her limbs. Blood trickled from Sue's nose like tears, but slowly, impossibly, life returned to the perfect body. Both women opened their eyes at the same moment. The fight that followed was inevitable as gravity. Creator versus creation, original versus copy, the dying versus the undying. They grappled with the fury of animals, Elizabeth's rage lending strength to her decaying limbs, while Sue fought with the desperate intensity of someone who'd tasted paradise and refused to give it up. Elizabeth felt ribs crack under Sue's perfect fists. Sue's beautiful face split open when Elizabeth connected with a lamp base. They rolled across the apartment floor like lovers or mortal enemies, and in this case, the distinction had become meaningless. The bathroom mirror exploded in a shower of silver fragments when Sue slammed Elizabeth's face against it. Each impact drove shards deeper into Elizabeth's flesh, but the pain was distant now, lost in the white-hot fury of finally fighting back. "Stop," Elizabeth tried to say through her ruined mouth. "We are O." But Sue was beyond reason, beyond mercy. She kicked Elizabeth with mechanical precision, each blow designed to cause maximum damage. The coffee table shattered under Elizabeth's weight, glass embedding itself in her back like crystal scales. Elizabeth felt herself dying with each impact, her consciousness fragmenting like the mirror that had cut her face. But as the darkness closed in, she managed one final act of defiance. Her arthritic fingers closed around a shard of broken glass, and she drove it up into Sue's perfect throat. They died together, matrix and copy, creator and creation, their blood mingling on the apartment floor in patterns that might have been beautiful if viewed from the right angle. But death, Elizabeth discovered, was just another kind of transformation. In the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, something new began to grow. Something that was neither Elizabeth nor Sue, but a fusion of both, all the beauty of youth combined with all the bitter wisdom of age. The thing that opened its eyes in the spreading pool of blood was magnificent and terrible, perfect and ruined, young and ancient all at once. It had work to do. 50 million people were waiting. Chapter 6. The Monsters Ball. The thing that had once been Elizabeth and Sue stood before the bathroom mirror like a fever dream given flesh. In the fractured glass, a dozen different reflections stared back, some beautiful, some ancient, all wrong in ways that defied human comprehension. What looked back was evolution run backwards, perfection turned inside out, the logical endpoint of a bargain made with forces that understood neither mercy nor restraint. The creature, for that's what it had become, bore fragments of both women like a collage assembled by a madman. Sue's perfect breasts jutted from unexpected places, while Elizabeth's aged skin stretched over bones that shouldn't exist. Teeth grew in random clusters along its jaw and chest, each one white as fresh snow and sharp as broken promises. On its back, Elizabeth's face emerged like a fossilized scream, eyes wide with the horror of witnessing her own transformation. It called itself Monstro Elisa Sue, the name emerging from its ruined throat like a broken prayer. The sound was wet and organic, as if the very act of speech required the cooperation of organs that had never been designed to work together. But there was work to be done. A show to perform. 50 million people waiting to be entertained by what they thought was still human. The princess dress fought against the creature's malformed anatomy, fabric stretching and tearing as it tried to contain flesh that refused to conform to any reasonable shape. The zipper climbed slowly up its back, covering Elizabeth's embedded face like a burial shroud. Makeup became an exercise in futility. How do you apply lipstick to a mouth that exists in 3 different places? How do you style hair that falls out in clumps at the slightest touch? The mirror reflected a nightmare wearing a tiara, and for the first time since the transformation, Monstro Elisasu felt something approaching joy. This was truth at last, not the lies of youth or the deceptions of beauty, but the honest horror of what people became when they wanted too much, too badly, for too long. The journey to the studio felt like a pilgrimage through a city that no longer belonged to creatures like her. Los Angeles slept under a blanket of smog and dreams, unaware that something fundamentally wrong was moving through its arteries like a virus in the bloodstream. The creature left a trail of organic matter in its wake, pieces of itself sloughing off with each step, breadcrumbs leading back to an apartment that now contained more death than life. The studio lot was exactly as she remembered from Sue's stolen memories, but everything felt smaller now, more fragile. These buildings and people and cameras were just props in a play about importance, temporary structures built on foundations of sand and self-deception. Monstro Elisasu understood now what she'd never grasped as Elisabeth or Sue. None of it mattered. Beauty faded, careers ended, and everyone died alone. But that knowledge brought its own kind of freedom. The security guard's badge reader accepted Sue's card without question. Technology, it seemed, was more accepting of transformation than biology. The hallways that had once felt like pathways to glory now resembled the intestines of some massive beast, fluorescent lights humming overhead like the buzz of feeding flies. Monstro Elisasu made her way to the soundstage with the determination of a salmon swimming upstream to spawn and die. Behind her, she could hear the wet sounds of her own decomposition, the soft plop of tissue hitting linoleum, the whisper of skin sloughing away like old wallpaper. By the time she reached the stage, she was leaving a trail that looked like something had been dragged through an abattoir. The dancers were already in position, their perfect bodies arranged like offerings to the god of prime-time television. Each one wore the same expression of manufactured joy that Sue had perfected, and each one represented everything that Monstro Elisasu had once desperately wanted to be: young, beautiful, relevant, loved. Now they just looked like children playing dress-up in a graveyard. Harvey sat in the front row with his collection of shareholders, his face glowing with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd created something valuable. He'd built an empire on the worship of youth and beauty, convinced that these qualities were not just desirable, but essential. Monstro Elisasu looked forward to showing him how wrong he was. The countdown began like a heartbeat racing toward cardiac arrest. 5, 4, 3. The lights blazed to life with the intensity of dying stars, and Monstro Elisasu stepped into their embrace like a moth accepting immolation. The cameras turned toward her with their insectoid patience, ready to broadcast her image to millions of homes where families gathered around electronic altars to worship at the shrine of entertainment. 2, 1. The moment stretched like taffy, time becoming elastic as reality prepared to accommodate something it had never been designed to contain. Monstro Elisasu felt the weight of 50 million gazes settling on her malformed shoulders, felt the collective intake of breath as a nation prepared to be entertained. Then she opened her mouth to speak, and everything went to hell. "I am so happy to be with you to fight," she began, her voice a wet symphony of misplaced consonants and anatomical impossibility. The paper mask she'd glued to her face, Elisabeth's old publicity photo, began to peel away like sunburned skin, revealing the chaos beneath. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of horror that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Even the cameras hesitated, their mechanical eyes struggling to process what they were seeing. This wasn't television. This wasn't entertainment. This was something crawling out of a medical textbook's most disturbing chapter. Then the screaming began. It started with a single woman's voice, high and pure and absolutely terrified, and spread through the studio audience like wildfire. "The monster!" someone shouted, and suddenly everyone was moving, pushing, fighting to get away from the thing that stood center stage like a violation of natural law. Monstro Elisasu tried to explain, tried to make them understand that she was still the same person they'd loved, just improved, just perfected. But her words came out as linguistic soup, consonants and vowels mixing with bodily fluids in combinations that hurt to hear. A spotlight swiveled to illuminate her fully, and the effect was like opening a door to hell. Every flaw, every impossible angle, every place where Elisabeth and Sue had been forcibly merged became visible in merciless detail. The audience's horror reached a crescendo that shattered the careful illusion of controlled entertainment. Someone threw something, a shoe, maybe, or a program, and it struck Monstro Elisa Sue in what might have been her face. The impact dislodged more pieces of her anatomy, sending a spray of organic matter across the first 3 rows like some obscene confetti. The hand that came off in the microphone stand was almost anticlimactic. Monstro Elisa Sue watched with detached interest as her appendage remained gripped around the metal pole while blood fountained from her wrist stump. The crowd's panic reached fever pitch as crimson rain fell on Harvey and his shareholders, painting their expensive suits in shades of biological truth. This was it, Monstro Elisa Sue realized. This was the moment when all pretense fell away, when the careful lies that held civilization together finally cracked under the weight of honest horror. She was no longer trying to entertain or seduce or convince. She was simply existing, and that existence was enough to drive an entire room to madness. The beating that followed felt like absolution. Fists and feet and improvised weapons rained down on her malformed body, each blow a vote of no confidence in the very concept of improvement through chemistry. The crowd had become a mob, and the mob had found its monster. As consciousness faded under the assault, Monstro Elisa Sue felt something that might have been peace. The show must go on, they always said. But sometimes the show was just about showing people what they really were when the lights came up and the masks came off. Sometimes the show was about monsters, and sometimes the monsters won, even when they lost. Chapter 7, The Long Walk Home. The thing that had been Monstro Elisa Sue dragged itself through the studio corridors like a wounded animal seeking a place to die. Behind her, the sounds of panic and retching faded into the white noise of civilization, collapsing one small moment at a time. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered like dying neurons, casting her shadow in stuttering fragments across walls that would never be the same after tonight. Blood painted her passage in abstract expressionist strokes, arterial red mixed with the darker shades of internal bleeding, creating patterns that might have been beautiful if they hadn't been made of human suffering. Each step left pieces of herself behind, a finger here, a patch of skin there, fragments of what had once been 2 complete women, now scattered like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. The backstage corridor that had once seemed endless now felt like a birth canal in reverse, expelling her from the artificial womb of show business into the harsh reality of a world that had no use for monsters. The framed photographs of past performers watched her pass with their frozen smiles, each one a testament to the lies that held the entertainment industry together. Pretty faces hiding ugly truths, perfect bodies concealing rotting souls. Monstro Elisa Sue understood now what none of them had grasped. The only honest thing about any of it was the horror. The studio's back exit opened onto an alley that reeked of garbage and broken dreams. Los Angeles spread before her like a circuit board made of neon and desperation. 10 million people sleeping fitfully under a sky the color of dried blood. The city had created her through its collective hunger for perfection, and now she was returning to its streets like a plague walking home. Her legs gave out somewhere on Sunset Boulevard, the complex architecture of bone and sinew finally succumbing to the weight of impossible existence. She felt herself collapsing in stages, first the knees, then the hips, finally the entire lower half of her anatomy simply dissolving into component parts that had never been meant to work together. But she didn't stop moving, couldn't stop. Something deeper than instinct drove her forward, a homing signal that pulsed through what remained of her nervous system like a prayer made of pain. She knew where she needed to go, even if she couldn't articulate why. The pavement was rough against her diminishing form as she pulled herself along the sidewalk with whatever appendages still functioned. Passers-by crossed the street to avoid her, their faces twisted in expressions of disgust and terror that would have broken Elisabeth's heart and amused Sue to no end. Monstro Elisa Sue felt nothing but a distant satisfaction at their honesty. Finally, people were reacting to her with genuine emotion instead of the manufactured affection that had sustained her career. A police siren wailed in the distance, but it was moving away from her rather than toward. Even the authorities wanted nothing to do with what she'd become. She was beyond arrest, beyond medical intervention, beyond any solution that human society had developed for dealing with its failures. The billboard that bore Sue's image loomed over her like a monument to everything she'd lost and gained. 50 feet of perfect flesh advertising promises that had turned out to be true in the worst possible way. The smile on the billboard was exactly the one Sue had worn that first day in Harvey's office, full of confidence and ambition and the casual cruelty of youth. Monstro Elisa Sue looked up at her former self and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe in beauty, to think that perfection was something worth pursuing. The memory felt like something from someone else's life, a story told by a stranger about people who'd never really existed. The Walk of Fame stretched ahead of her like a spine made of stars, each embedded plaque a vertebra in the backbone of American mythology. She'd walked this stretch of Hollywood Boulevard thousands of times as Elisabeth, always carefully avoiding the spot where her own star was embedded. Success was supposed to be permanent, but she'd learned that everything was temporary except the hunger for more. By the time she reached her destination, Monstro Elisa Sue had shed most of what remained of her physical form. She existed now as something between liquid and consciousness, a puddle of organic matter held together by willpower and the last dregs of cellular memory. The tourists and late-night revelers gave her a wide berth, their faces masks of disgust and incomprehension. Elisabeth Sparkle's star lay before her like a pink granite grave marker, her name spelled out in brass letters that had tarnished with age and neglect. Someone had spilled ketchup on it years ago. She remembered the incident with crystalline clarity, and the stain had never quite come clean. Now it looked prophetic, a preview of the blood that would soon join it. With what remained of her strength, Monstro Elisa Sue pulled herself onto the star's surface. The marble was cold against her dissolving flesh, cold and eternal, and utterly indifferent to the dreams that had once driven her to seek a place among the immortals. The sky above began to lighten with the approach of dawn, and with it came something that might have been hallucination or might have been grace. Golden confetti started falling from nowhere, each flake catching the early light like pieces of a shattered halo. It reminded her of the snow globe she'd destroyed in her apartment, the one with the tiny Elisabeth figure standing on her own pink star. The applause started softly, like the whisper of wind through dead leaves, then grew to a thunderous crescendo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. In her mind, Monstro Elisa Sue could see the audience she'd always dreamed of, thousands of faces turned toward her with genuine love and admiration, hands clapping in appreciation for a performance that had finally been completely honest. This was her moment, her real moment. Not the manufactured celebration of her star's installation or the hollow victory of Sue's television success, but this, the absolute truth of what she'd become laid bare for anyone brave enough to look. She was beautiful now in the way that disasters were beautiful, in the way that endings could be more magnificent than beginnings. The golden confetti fell heavier, covering her dissolving form like a burial shroud made of light, and she felt herself becoming part of the pavement, part of the star, part of the eternal dream of Hollywood that promised everything and delivered exactly what it said it would. The tourists who found her remains the next morning would tell different stories about what they'd seen. Some would swear it was just a homeless person who died during the night. Others would insist it had been some kind of elaborate special effects display gone wrong. A few would whisper about monsters and transformations, but their voices would be drowned out by the more rational explanations that helped people sleep at night. But the street sweeper who cleaned up the mess would remember the smell, not of death, but of something else entirely. Something that reminded him of perfume and promise and the particular sadness that came from getting exactly what you asked for. The star itself would seem different afterward, though no one could quite say why. The brass letters would gleam a little brighter, the pink marble would feel warmer to the touch, And occasionally, on very quiet nights when the city held its breath, people passing by would swear they could hear the sound of applause echoing up from somewhere deep beneath the pavement. Elisabeth Sparkle had finally found her audience, and her audience had found her. Chapter 8. Everything Flows. 6 months after the incident, as the media had taken to calling it, Hollywood Boulevard looked exactly the same as it always had. The stars embedded in the sidewalk continued their eternal watch over the dreams and delusions of 10 million souls, each bronze nameplate a small monument to the peculiar American belief that fame could cheat death. Dr. Sarah Chen walked the length of the Walk of Fame every morning on her way to work at the UCLA Medical Center, where she specialized in the kind of cases that other doctors preferred to forget. Rare diseases, impossible conditions, the medical mysteries that fell through the cracks of conventional understanding. Her colleagues called her the Queen of Lost Causes, and she wore the title like a badge of honor. This morning, like every morning for the past 6 months, she paused at Elisabeth Sparkle's star. The official report had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic creativity. Gas leak explosion, chemical contamination, unfortunate acts involving an unstable individual, and industrial solvents. The kind of explanation that sounded plausible enough to satisfy journalists, but vague enough to discourage deeper investigation. Dr. Chen had been one of the first responders that night, summoned to the scene by paramedics who'd taken one look at the remains and decided they needed someone with experience in the impossible. What she'd found on that star had challenged everything she thought she knew about human biology, chemistry, and the basic laws that governed organic matter. The tissue samples she'd managed to collect before the cleanup crew arrived told a story that read like science fiction written by a sadist. Cellular structure that defied classification, DNA sequences that seemed to belong to multiple individuals simultaneously, proteins that shouldn't have been able to exist in nature, let alone in a living organism. But perhaps most disturbing were the traces of the unknown compound they'd found in the samples, a fluorescent yellow substance that seemed to accelerate cellular division while simultaneously causing rapid aging in adjacent tissue. The lab had never seen anything like it, and after 3 months of testing, they'd quietly filed the samples away in a vault marked for unusual specimens. Dr. Chen suspected she was one of only a handful of people who knew the real story, or at least part of it. The others were all bound by non-disclosure agreements that carried serious federal penalties, the kind of paperwork that appeared when something fell outside the normal boundaries of human experience. But standing here now, looking down at the star that had been scrubbed clean of all evidence, Dr. Chen couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. It was just waiting for the next chapter to begin. The facility in the warehouse district had been shuttered within days of the incident, its contents seized by agencies that operated without acronyms or public oversight. But places like that never really disappeared, Dr. Chen knew. They just moved, adapted, found new ways to offer old temptations to people desperate enough to pay any price for transformation. Human nature was remarkably consistent in its hungers. The young woman who approached her that morning looked like 1,000 other hopefuls who migrated to Los Angeles with dreams bigger than their bank accounts. Early 20s, pretty in the way that suggested good genes and expensive dental work, carrying herself with the particular combination of confidence and desperation that marked someone who'd been told all her life that she was special. "Excuse me," the girl said, her voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that had been carefully coached out of existence. "Are you Dr. Chen? I was told you might be able to help me with something." Dr. Chen studied the young woman's face, noting the subtle signs of cosmetic intervention that had become as common as tattoos among her generation. A nose job here, lip fillers there, the gradual erosion of natural features in pursuit of an ideal that existed only in carefully filtered photographs. "That depends," Dr. Chen said carefully, "on what kind of help you're looking for." The girl glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "I heard about what happened here, about Elisabeth Sparkle, about what she became." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I heard there might be others like her, others who tried enhancement." Dr. Chen felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing patterns she'd hoped never to see again. What makes you think that? Because I've been getting messages, the girl said. Phone calls, text messages, from a number that doesn't exist when I try to call it back. Someone offering me everything I've ever wanted. Youth, beauty, success. She paused, her eyes reflecting the kind of hunger that Dr. Chen had learned to fear. A better version of myself. The USB stick the girl pulled from her purse was identical to the dozens that had been found in Elisabeth Sparkle's apartment, each one containing the same seductive video, the same impossible promises. Dr. Chen had watched that footage enough times to recite it from memory, had studied every frame looking for clues about the source. Have you watched it? Dr. Chen asked. The girl nodded. 3 times, maybe 4. Her fingers trembled as she held the device. It shows you things about yourself, about what you could become if you just had the courage to change. Dr. Chen looked down at Elisabeth Sparkle's star, at the brass letters that spelled out a name that had once meant something to millions of people. The marble was warm under the morning sun, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard something, a sound like distant applause, like the echo of dreams refusing to die. Listen to me very carefully, Dr. Chen said, taking the USB stick from the girl's hands. Whatever you think this can give you, whatever you believe you need to become, it's not worth the price. Trust me on this. The girl's face crumpled with disappointment and barely suppressed rage. You don't understand. You're already beautiful. You're already successful. You don't know what it's like to be invisible, to watch everyone else get the things you want just because they won the genetic lottery. Dr. Chen thought about Elisabeth Sparkle, about the woman who'd had everything the girl claimed to want and had thrown it all away chasing something even better. She thought about the tissue samples locked in her laboratory vault, about the compound that promised perfection and delivered only horror. You're right, she said finally. I don't understand, but I've seen what happens to people who think they do. The girl snatched the USB stick back with movements sharp as broken glass. Maybe she just didn't do it right. Maybe she wasn't strong enough to handle the transformation. Her eyes blazed with the kind of certainty that could move mountains or destroy souls. Maybe I'll be different. Dr. Chen watched her walk away, another dreamer heading toward the same cliff that had claimed Elisabeth Sparkle and countless others before her. She could have called out, could have tried harder to warn her, but experience had taught her that some people could only learn by falling. The cycle would continue because it had to continue, because as long as humans existed, there would be those willing to trade everything for the promise of becoming something more than what they were. The substance, whatever it really was, wherever it really came from, understood this fundamental truth about human nature. It didn't create the hunger. It just fed it. As Dr. Chen resumed her walk to the hospital, she didn't notice the small crack that had appeared in Elisabeth Sparkle's star, running through the brass letters like a fault line in the Earth's crust. She didn't see the way the morning light seemed to bend slightly around the edges of the marble, or hear the whisper of wind that sounded almost like breathing. But if she had looked back, she might have seen something else, a figure reflected in the window of a nearby shop, watching from the shadows with eyes that held all the patience of the dead. The nurse from the hospital, the one with the piercing blue eyes and the strawberry birthmark on his forearm, he was still recruiting. The business was still growing, and somewhere in a new facility, in a new city, fresh vials of golden promise were being prepared for the next customer willing to pay the ultimate price for perfection. After all, everyone deserved a chance to become their best self, even if their best self was also their last self. The universe had a sense of humor about these things. Everything flows, nothing remains. The words were carved so small on the edge of Elisabeth's star that you'd have to know exactly where to look to find them. Most people walked right over them without noticing, too busy chasing their own dreams to pay attention to the warnings written in stone. But they were there, waiting. Like everything else in Hollywood, they were just waiting for their close-up.